In life, all people look for happiness. And to be happy, you need a healthy self-esteem. Men's self-esteem and women's self-esteem come from different elements. Marriage can be either the best experience in life or the worst. We have two choices. Think about what I'm getting from marriage and be unhappy, or focus, what am I giving to this marriage? Marriage is when man and woman decide to become one. The trouble begins when they're deciding which one.
Welcome to the Jewish Marriage Podcast, your home for unique, insightful conversations on all things Jewish dating and marriage. I'm your host, Yisrael Glick, and I'm honored to welcome our guest for today, Rabbi Ari Laine, Rabbi of the Bethel Ashkenazi community of Panama and author of the book GPS for a Happier Marriage. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, writing a book, just to start, is an enormous undertaking. It's a massive job. Not something presumably anyone would do just on a whim. I'm certainly happy that you wrote the book. What drove you, what motivated you and compelled you to feel like you needed to write this book?
So that's actually a great question. So many years ago, I came to Panama in 1994. And at the time, I was 24 years old, my wife was 19, and people started asking me advice for marriage. I had no clue anything about marriage. People who were married 15 or 20 years. I said to myself, something doesn't sound right. I realized that in most communities, people go to the therapists and only come to the rabbi at the end. But in Panama, most people were coming to the rabbi at the beginning.
Is that like a cultural thing with Panama versus, let's say, more Western?
It's actually very cultural because the majority of the community are from Sephardic descent. And in their concept, the rabbi knows everything. Although I'm the Ashkenazi rabbi, there's a lot of influence. So I dedicated a lot of time to start understanding and learning about marriage. And eventually I developed some ideas. And I gave a talk, probably sometime 2008.
This was a talk for your community there?
Talk for my community. And the president of my community was a very smart person, a very dear friend. He said, you must write a book. I've never heard this anywhere else. So I took his bad advice. Because if you never wrote a book and you don't know how to write, that's a very bad idea, okay? However, maybe 7 years later.
Well, it turns out it seems it wasn't such a bad idea.
Yeah, but the amount of effort and the amount of time and the amount of mistakes, one writer, a second writer. But eventually that's how the book came out. And yes, in retrospect, I think it's very, very, very beautiful because I only receive very good feedback from the people that read it. That's the only condition. You need to read it.
Yes. So there have been existing books that sort of address, the fundamental ideas that you address. Like, for example, probably the best known one would be Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. Is there something that you felt, maybe you just weren't familiar with that book and others like it, or is there something that you felt that was missing that you wanted to add? Was it just that you wanted to present the idea from a Torah perspective?
That's a very good question because there are some similarities and on the contrary. After I read these books, I realized it was missing a very essential message. Most of these books, whether it's Men Are From Mars, The 5 Languages of Love, they talk about differences. And I wanted to try to understand the reason, the cause of the differences. It's not enough just tell a woman, listen, men do it differently. Oh, and the women do it differently. I wanted people to understand why we do it differently. And when you understand the core reason, they don't just accept it like, dogma. And the more you understand the differences and why they're caused, makes it easier for each person to accept the other person in a much better way.
Okay, so would it be fair to say that you wanted to introduce, let's say, a layer of meaning to the picture? So rather than just addressing it in a way that's, let's say, giving people the skills and the understanding of the facts as they are, but to introduce a layer of meaning, which is then going to perhaps change the whole approach that people have.
Like, for example, if you have a headache, what do? Most people take a Tylenol. Is the Tylenol fixing the problem? Probably not. Maybe it'll take away the pain. But if your headache is coming because you have some underlying more serious issue, the Tylenols, the pills aren't going to work. And that's what I feel. You tell people marriage isn't working. Well, men do it that way. Well, that's not helping me. It doesn't make me happier. It doesn't make me feel more loved. So you're not really fixing the problem. You're just saying, ignore the problem. And I want people to understand. And the more you understand the problem, you can be part of the solution. And that's really what I'm trying to do.
Love it. Okay, so one of the things that I really appreciate about the book immediately when I opened it was you've managed to write it and to present so much valuable information in a way that's so easy to read. You can almost read through it without even realizing how much is in there because it's just so comfortable and smooth and easy to read. You present things in a way that's comfortable and simple, easy to remember. And one of the things you've done is looked at, let's say, the differences between common, let's say, natural, stereotypical masculine personality and feminine personality. And you've talked about the 3 Ps of the masculine personality and the 3 As of the feminine personality. Can you give us a little bit of an introduction into what the 3 Ps are and the 3 As are?
So to start with, my premise is every marriage will fail. And I believe it's so important to understand why marriage will fail. Because if you don't, people come with certain expectations, which eventually won't work. If you understand why marriage will fail, then you can address the issues and make it work.
Depending on how you define fail.
Correct. Well, at any level of fail, because failure. Failure doesn't only mean divorce. You have many people that are married and are unhappily married. And my goal with my book was to help people get to the top 10% of really happily and fulfilled marriages. So understanding that, like you mentioned, to simplify it, we talk about 3 Ps and 3 As. In life, all people look for happiness. And to be happy, we know you need a healthy self-esteem. And what I try to define is men's self-esteem and women's self-esteem come from different elements. Now, obviously, I need to remind everyone, make a disclaimer. These are generalities. You have women with masculine characteristics and men with feminine characteristics. But overall, men for their self-esteem look for 3 things. Like we said, the 3 Ps, whether it's prestige, power, or pleasure, and pleasure. So men, they're going to universities, they want to talk about how successful they are. You know, some people ask me, why don't you say money? Because people don't look for money. Money helps you get, in life, prestige, power, and pleasure. So really, money is just a means to get these 3 Ps. A person buys his new car, the car of his dreams. What is that? For him, it's prestige, it's power, and pleasure. On the other side, women look for things that boost their self-esteem. We call it the 3 As. The first A, the most important one, is affection. Affection for a woman means to feel loved, get attention, appreciation, acknowledgement. The second A?
Those were all A's in there as well.
All 1A, that's the big A, right. Exactly.
Lots of little A's.
Exactly. The second A is since her appearance is part of her self-esteem. As you know, you go into the home of any married couple, you see how much space in the closet you have for the woman's stuff and how much for the men's stuff. It's obvious. You go to any mall, look how many stores are selling stuff for women and how many stores are selling for men. And the third A is a sense of accomplishment. Whether it's their job, it's their career. In the olden days, for a woman, her marriage was her sense of accomplishment. But overall, these are the 3 Ps and the 3 As that people look for to feel, like I said, to get their self-esteem. Understanding this is really the key to understanding how we work differently and how we can react differently in many situations.
Right. And I guess the point of understanding that is that the better we understand the way that someone else ticks, the better equipped we'll be, the more empowered we'll be to be able to work with that in a way that's constructive and healthy and going to move things in a positive direction.
Correct. And to be a little more specific, you know, when a man does something and a woman translates it in a different way, we have a problem. So, for example, you know, in the famous Men Are From Mars, he talks about this one idea. When you get into a discussion to a woman, when she's upset, she wants closeness with her spouse. And a man, when he's upset with someone, he wants to be distant. So imagine when a man feels his wife is upset, what is he going to do? He's going to try to stay away from her when she would like him to see how to fix it by coming closer. So here's just a simple example of how things are just the opposite way. For a woman, when her husband comes home late, she translates it as, he doesn't love me. If he loved me, he would be here on time. He has no clue. He got late because he got into a conversation with a friend, something happened. To him, not coming late doesn't prove that he doesn't love his wife or that she doesn't love him. But the way they translate these small actions create bigger problems.
And I guess, let's say in that example of coming late, even if the reason that the husband came home late was something that was completely beyond his control, he left on time, there was an accident on the highway, whatever it is, when he comes home with that awareness that this is something that really bothers his wife or hurts her, he'll be in a position, he'll understand the value of consoling, telling her that he's sorry, even though it's not his fault, etc.
Exactly, that's correct. So instead of taking it personally and saying, why is she getting at me? What's wrong? I came home 15 minutes late. Once he can understand that my wife, she needs affection, and she's translating this, that I didn't love her, because I didn't send her the message, I didn't call her. So he stops taking it personally. So one of the big problems is when I take it personally. My wife says, why did you come home late? They go, what's wrong with you? Something happened, and I start feeling attacked. And then I respond in the same way. So we start escalating something. And once they can understand, no, what my wife needs is to feel loved. And this was an action, even though beyond my control, unwillingly, but that made her feel unloved, or not that I'm not concerned about her enough, then I don't take it so personal. Then instead of going on the attack, I'm able to fix it much easier. So it's really understanding where the other person is coming from to be able to deal with it.
Okay. So the thing is, you do a lot of, give a lot of insight, practical insight into how to get these, the P's and the A's to work together, and we'll get to that. But before we get there, it almost seems like, and this idea is stressed in the fact that you talk about the P's and the A's, and men are from Mars and women are from Venus. We see that it almost looks like men and women, again, generally, or masculine personality, feminine personalities, are designed to be so different that it takes so much work to get them to come together. And, we believe that family is important, marriage is important, etc. There has to be a reason that the Creator would design us in a way that makes that so challenging. It's almost like God says, I want you to get married and to have a family, and I'm going to design you in a way that's going to make that really, really difficult. There has to be a good reason for that. What might that reason be?
Yeah, in other words, you're saying it's a recipe for disaster.
Yes.
Why do you make it so complicated?
And clearly an intentional recipe for disaster by God. Why?
So really it would come down to the deeper question, why does God create marriage? Perhaps if he wanted to design it differently, people can have children without getting married.
Right.
So the deeper perspective, the spiritual perspective is, we believe that ultimately we're here in this world to be able to have a relationship with God. However, it's a very big problem because God is infinite, he's abstract, we're finite, and we're human. So God wants us to learn how to have a relationship with him through having a relationship with our spouse. The essence of any relationship with God is learning how to become more humble, be able to put yourself on the side, what we call selfless instead of selfish. According to the Hasidic teachers, God gives the Torah on Mount Sinai. And on Mount Sinai, although it was in a desert, on this mountain was growing trees and fruits. And the question is, why was it necessary? No one ate from those fruits. Moses went up to heaven for 120 days. And the answer, according to the Hasidic teachers, is to teach us the desert is selfish. It doesn't want to share anything. But Judaism is trying to teach us how to become selfless, always be able to give to others. The right exact place to learn this is in marriage, where if you want a marriage to work, you have to be willing to put yourself on the side. If you just want everything to be your way, it can't work. You have to be able to learn a different perspective. At times, ask forgiveness. Many times, forgive. Close an eye. So it's really about putting yourself on the side. No marriage can really work. A happy marriage if both people are considerate about themselves. Rabbi Manis Friedman has this line, why is marriages not working today? Because people are already married to themselves. If you're not willing to divorce yourself, you really can't have a relationship with someone else. And once we learn that, then we're learning to have a relationship with God. Learning to go out of ourselves is helping us learn that unique relationship. And that's why marriage needs to be difficult. So if it's marriage was just about us enjoying life, having a good time, so it's the mess. Oops. Really bad. But if marriage is about us learning how to become better people and less concerned about our needs and focused on other needs, it's perfect.
Wow, love it. So it almost something that comes to mind for me, a similar thing would be if you're training someone to, let's say, get in a boxing ring and compete in combat sports, and you tell them to read a book and learn how to do it and then jump in the ring to fight, that would be a really bad idea. You want them to spar and to actually learn what it feels like to maybe to get hit, what it takes to actually respond, to step up. So in a sense, marriage is designed in a way that it forces us to learn humility to a second party, to our partner, which will then be the model upon which we can take that and build that humility into our relationship with God. Now moving on to the practicalities, the skills, let's say, or the reality of making the P's and the A's work together. We understand why we're designed this way. So now we have to, have the humility and actually make it happen. So I want to talk about this on two levels. So obviously the first level would be, if men are from Mars, women are from Venus, we have 3 P's, 3 A's. What does it take to get them to work together in a way that's, let's say, functional, manageable, and healthy? And then beyond that, because marriage is not just supposed to be functional, right? People go into marriage with this promise and understanding that it can be and should be and ultimately is supposed to be profoundly fulfilling and to bring meaning to our lives that we couldn't have without it. So what does it take to sort of bring the P's and the A's together? Again, first of all, to be functional, and then beyond that, to get to a point where it's not just functional, but it's beautiful and it's amazing and it's fulfilling.
So King Solomon, in one verse says, marriage is great. Matzah isha, matzah tov. In a different verse, he says, marriage is a disaster. So the question is, what's going on here?
You just translate that last
Yes. I find marriage even worse than death.
Ouch.
Yes. So how does it work? I mean, how did he forget what he wrote in one place? He rewrote it. So the simple answer is, King Solomon was married to 700 women. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Well, he had all types. He had some good ones and bad ones. But since it's part of our tradition, we obviously realize there's a message for all of us. And the beautiful message is, marriage can be either the best experience in life or the worst, the same day. It's either the most fulfilling experience or the most humiliating experience.
In those two statements is telling us what the possibilities are.
Exactly what the possibilities are. And we all know. And really, the objective, like you said before, of marriage is to become one, according to Judaism. A very true, deep relationship. However, here's the catch. Nothing in life that's really worthwhile or fulfilling comes easy. Easy come, easy goes. And therefore, you really need to make an effort. So, how I find it on a psychological level, what is the depth of marriage? When the person you're married to can accept you unconditionally. When you come to that level in a relationship, although we're so different, and we have each our own baggage and our imperfections, but when you come to a marriage and the other person accepts you completely, that is the highest emotional level a person can reach. That can only happen when you're willing to sacrifice and put yourself on the side. When both people are willing to do that, then they can come to a point when I'm here for you and you're here for me. When I'm focused on my own needs and you on your own needs, there is no way we can actually accept the other person's imperfections, because my spouse's imperfections, I don't like, I'm not happy with. So if I'm able to start focusing on the things that I appreciate about you and accept you completely, then we reach the true definition of marriage. So in simple words, if I'm focused on myself, it cannot happen. Fulfilling marriages, when I do what marriage is intended for, I'm able to move out of myself, try to focus on helping someone else, accepting someone else. And when we both focus that way, we're much happier. In one more line, I would say, we have two choices. Think about what I'm getting from marriage and be unhappy? Or focus, what am I giving to this marriage, and be very happy?
Okay, so is that, let's say, sort of the foundation of bringing the P's and the A's together? When each person is putting the other one before themselves, then the differences between them cease to be a source of issue or a source of problems.
Definitely. Precisely to remember that it's not that we don't want to understand our spouse. We can't understand our spouse because our needs, how we're wired, is so different. It's like trying to teach someone the color purple or green if they're colorblind. How do you do that? Well, it's not black, it's not white, but what is it? And to a certain extent, that's what marriage is. We are so
Until
wired.
someone reads your book.
Of course. But even after you read it, it's now married almost 30 years, actually just 30 years. And till today, I still make the same mistakes. Much less because I'm more aware of it. But this, when you read my book, you can understand, the logical perspective, understanding the rationale, how it works. But to bring it into practice is something you need to work on every day. It doesn't happen by itself. I can still make mistakes. The advantage I have is I know how the system works. And therefore, when I make the mistake, I'm very clear to realize my mistake and fix it. To most people, they don't think they made a mistake. It's my spouse's fault. And once I'm focused, it's their fault. And it's not that, it's an imperfection in the system that I need to learn how to deal with. It's a whole different ballgame. If it's their fault, why don't they fix it? Why don't they do something about it? If I understand that they're wired differently, and they understand I'm wired differently, so it's much easier for us to work on a happy medium. If I don't get that, marriage, based on what I understand and what I wrote, is a disaster. As long as the husband is focusing on his peace, where is his wife? When a man is looking for his prestige, power, and pleasure, his wife is abandoned. What does a woman do when she feels abandoned? She starts acting unhappy, maybe miserable, starts blaming everything on her husband. Where does that go? He's not understanding what he did wrong. So he starts reacting and responding. He says, what are you talking about? Instead of understanding, well, all she's saying is, I'm not feeling loved or cared for, or I don't feel I'm your priority. He's getting the wrong message. So he continues to make her feel worse. So not understanding this, it just goes from bad to worse. But when I understand it and my wife reacts and I say, the book says, if your wife is upset about something, it's your fault. Not intentionally. You did something unintentionally that made her feel less loved. She's not your priority. She feels that your new car is more important, or your friends are more important, or your hobbies are more important than her. That makes a reaction that obviously makes her feel unloved. And then it's a downhill spiral.
All right, so I guess then the idea here perhaps is that even if someone's not guilty of the fact that their spouse is upset, the bottom line is they invariably have some sort of role that they played intentionally or not, etc., which means that they have, let's say, both the opportunity and responsibility to do whatever they can to make things better, not because they're guilty and therefore they have to make things better, but because this is just the way it works in reality.
And understanding that makes it easier for one himself. Instead of feeling, oh boy, it's my fault, and that has a negative reaction inside of us. We don't like to feel we're at fault, especially if we're not. Realizing it's not I'm at fault, but the way I'm wired makes my wife or my husband feel uncomfortable. Let me just try to fix it.
Right, so the fault is really irrelevant.
Exactly. And also understanding that it's not my fault makes it easier for me to go out of my way. So if you had an argument and your wife is upset, and most people, it's hard for them to say, I'm sorry. To apologize means, oh, I did something wrong. Hey, you can apologize even if you did nothing wrong. I'm apologizing because in my spouse's perspective, I did something wrong. Not that it's really I did something wrong. So it takes a lot away of the uncomfortable feeling of I'm a mess up. I messed up. I'm just not good.
Right. And I guess when we go into any pursuit in life with a foundation of negative emotion, it just reduces the likelihood of success. Definitely. So when we separate the responsibility to help improve things from whether or not we're guilty. It means that we can take responsibility for doing what we have to do without having to have any of that negative emotion involved. Okay, love it. So now I'm not sure whether or not there's going to be anything to add here specifically, but these are, let's say, the foundations and what we need to know to get it to work and to make it into something beautiful and fulfilling. I wonder is there something specific or maybe not so specific, but things that people can be aware of or do to really capitalize on the differences. So not just to overcome the differences and make the connection between them and their spouse fulfilling, but to make it everything it could be by making the most of the fact that they're as different as they are. Because again, there has to be some sort of, purpose and additional, let's say, value available as a result of those differences. Is there something to do to move things in that direction to get there?
So that's a very valuable point, because if we can understand that, it brings our marriage to the next level. And the truth is, in every business, you have different types of personalities. You have people in charge of marketing, you have people in charge of the accounting. Very different types of minds, but they're both necessary for the success of the business. And instead of seeing our spouse as the problem, when you start focusing, hey, what does my spouse bring to this relationship? So in most marriages, especially in the traditional marriages, where the woman is more connected to their kids, spends more time with them, understanding that my wife's connection to affection is so important, to be able to give up so much of her time to be there for the kids and spend hours and hours and hours in educating them, different to maybe her husband's capacity or character. Hey, so just because sometimes it works against me, that's fine. We have to be able to focus on understanding the value of those personalities. And I usually say, what usually brings people, their initial attraction usually starts working against them. So if this woman was attracted to this man because he was such a strong personality, he gave her so much security, hey, and then after they get married, he goes, hey, we have a problem, why don't you take care of it? He goes, 1 second, why are you becoming so tough? No, I was always tough. That's what she fell in love with. And now it's working against her. Or vice versa. When he says she's such a sweet, docile person, and then he wants her to become a little more aggressive or a little more determined, it does work that way. So we really need to realize that what I was attracted to my spouse is usually certain qualities that are going to be good in certain areas and not in every area. And remember, as a couple, as a unit, we need all these elements to be able to be successful in our lives, raising our children, etc. Understanding that is when I see something I don't like, hey, remember, no one has it all. Focus on the good things, and then we'll have less expectations and be much more fulfilled.
Okay, so ultimately now what we have is this picture where marriage inevitably by definition includes or involves these very different personalities. It comes with a lot of challenges. So we're not supposed to be the same as our spouse, right? We're not trying to find a situation in which there aren't going to be challenges because of how different we are, because that's part of reality. The question then becomes, how far do we take that? Because, we don't just find someone randomly and marry them, right? There is a process of dating, of courtship, of getting to know people. And there's different people maybe to different degrees, but everybody's somewhat selective. There's something we're looking for. So what distinguishes between the things that a person should say, you know what? Yeah, that's a reason why I'm not going to, pursue a long-term committed relationship with this person, versus the things where it's like, yes, this person's very different to me, and that's the way it's supposed to be, and that's fine.
You're asking very deep questions now. Are you sure everyone's capable?
I have full faith in the audience. Whether or not I'm going to be capable, we'll find out.
So, listen, what I would start with is, ultimately, for marriage to work, we need to have some type of connecting force. Everyone is different. And as Jews, we believe there is the person destined for you. But at the same time, God wants us to choose someone, although on a spiritual level, the person is chosen, but God wants us to do the process. For that to work, we need to start finding more things in common than less in common. Every marriage is going to have its challenges. But a person doesn't have to look for extra challenges. And therefore, what a person needs to do is make the list. What are the things that are really important for me? What are my priorities? What are the things I would like my spouse to have? Make a very comprehensive, logical list. And based on that, a person would start with, what are the qualities a person needs to be successful? So if I'm going out with someone that has no friends, that's a red flag. What's going on? If I'm going with a person that can't hold a job for more than 3 weeks, that's a red flag. Am I going with a person that is very aggressive when he meets people, always aggressive? So it's important to start identifying these elements which are valuable and basic for every long-term relationship. At the same time, realize no one's going to have everything I'm looking for. But to be able to identify the things that would make our relationship work better. And ultimately, that's what God wants from us. Not to just jump into a relationship, to be able to define the person that I would be able to have a good relationship with. At the end, of course, we need some divine blessings for it to work, as there are so many challenges. But that's really the way to start.
So let's say you mentioned here some examples of things that are like, let's say, as you put them, red flags. The sorts of things you mentioned are things that are going to be red flags for anybody, right? If someone has things that, let's say, are indications of the fact that they're struggling with basic functionality in life, that's going to be a red flag for anybody. Is there sort of something in between where there are things that, in terms of personality, let's say it's like, you know what? Yeah, this personality really isn't a good idea for me. Not because there are red flags, but that's not a good idea for me. But obviously, there has to also be a limit to that because, like you said, we are all different and everybody is going to end up marrying someone who is substantially different to themselves, and there will be those things they need to work on. So is there any sort of direction with how we can distinguish between maybe personality differences or things that are not a red flag, but yes, that's a valid reason to say this is not for me versus this is just part of life and the challenge of a relationship?
So it's interesting that the Medrash tells us of a certain noble woman who asked one of the great rabbis, what does God do since he created the world? I mean, he must do something. And he said, yes, he actually makes matches. He's the matchmaker. So she said, what? That's simple. And that night she said she had, the Medrash says she had 1,000 slaves and 1,000 women slaves, and she matched them all together. The next morning, they all came back, beaten up, black and blue. And she realized that it's not as simple as just matching up a man and a woman for a marriage to work. And to a certain extent, it seems like God made it in the system that you can't marry everyone in the world. There's going to be something what we call today the chemistry, which is actually very abstract. You just go, you see a woman, get married. No, there's someone very specific for you and someone that you're going to find and someone you're going to realize that's the right person. So it doesn't mean we don't have to look for the other elements. Like we said, what are the red flags? Make sure there's no red flags. And then the right person has to, at a certain point, create some type of connection. And that's what we believe.
Okay, so now in pursuing that point of connection, trying to find that person, something that a lot of people, let's say from outside of the, whatever we want to call it, orthodox, Torah observant community, notice that courtship and dating in this community tends to be very, very short relative to, their standards and expectations outside. People can meet someone and within a few weeks of meeting them for the first time, decide to marry them. Is that just that this, let's say, culture, the Torah values don't see a need for it to go beyond that? Are there particular values and benefits in it specifically intentionally being short? Just how short or long should it be?
So actually, I forgot to mention to your audience, you really need to read the book, GPS for a Happier Marriage, if you want to get the whole full picture.
Right.
And at the end, we have an appendix which talks about dating. And in simple words, I say, for a successful marriage to work, you need to be aligned on 4 different levels. We call the spiritual, the rational, the emotional, and the physical. Well, sounds simple. The difference is, in the observant world, we start from the top to the bottom, which means for us, and more important, to make sure that we're spiritually aligned. When I say rational is, I see this person has enough character or personality to be able to run a home, to be a spouse, to land a normal job. No, there's no red flags. There's no drugs going on. There's no other addictions that are going to affect the relationship. So once I start with the spiritual and rational, now what I need to do is decide if there's an emotional connection, right? In the world, in the secular world that we live in, people start just the opposite. They start with the physical. Do I like how this person looks? Is there an attraction? Is there an emotional? And they get caught up in that. What happens is most people don't even look at the rational or the spiritual. And there might be big red flags. But as we say in English, love is blind. Someone told me it's also deaf, okay? So eventually what happens is you just don't see the bigger picture. And that's the great difference. So in my case, I already had analyzed all the other elements, especially that my sister learned with my wife in the same class. So all the big questions about understanding personality, what this person wants to do, how does she react under different circumstances, I already knew. So now it's just about understanding if there's an emotional connection. And that you don't have to wait years to figure out. That happens quite quickly. So therefore, that's the advantage we have. We start from a different perspective. And in the world, if you don't start, since they start the other way, like I said, they miss the benchmarks. They miss the real objectives and the real important things. So for short-term marriages, it's enough to fall in love. If you want to have a long-term marriage, you really need to have the other elements in place first.
Okay. So the second section of your book, which is really where a lot of the foundations and the skills are addressed, is the section of the book is called "It's Not About Me, It's About You," right? Which is really, you've been speaking to that today about, humility, putting the other person first. But at the same time, obviously, you're not suggesting that everybody should be a doormat, right? If everybody becomes a doormat and everybody is just like, I don't exist, it's just about you. A relationship between two doormats isn't a marriage between two people, right? And it's not healthy for anyone if either person in the marriage just completely discards themselves and just makes it entirely about the other person. So what's the balance here between retaining a healthy identity and sense of self and at the same time putting the other person first and saying, like you say, it's not about me, it's about you?
That's a great question, actually. It brings to mind a thought I heard from Rabbi Tursky. May he rest in peace. Great rabbi, therapist, psychiatrist. He says, the verse says, love your fellow man as yourself. So if you want to love someone else, you need to love yourself first. A person who has no self-esteem, everything that their spouse wants, they'll do. They have no own self-esteem. They cannot eventually become someone who gives true love. People that are depressed, they come, they stand. I had someone in my office, he's depressed. I say, what's going on? He goes, no one loves me. What do you mean no one loves you? I know your family loves you. But if you feel depressed and you have no emotions, you can't feel that people love you. In a marriage, if you don't have your own needs, you really can't give other people their needs. And we all have our needs. And yes, is the question, should I put myself totally on the side to please my spouse? If it's what happens, then it's a one-way relationship. Because if only one person is putting itself on their side to please someone else, that's not a relationship. If both people are putting themselves on their side to please their spouse, then we're both getting our needs and giving needs. So your question will only apply if one person is putting themselves on the side for the other. That's not a relationship. So yes, we have natural needs. And usually, and the objective here is to get each spouse to be focused on their spouse. When you do that, we both be getting something. When it comes to a point that someone is narcissistic or cannot give their spouse any space to get their needs, eventually this marriage won't function, or at least it won't function the right way. Some people live in such relationships, but they're not happy relationships. No one can be happy if they don't get their needs. We all have needs. So it's about knowing your needs, not over-focusing on your needs. And that's a very difficult balance. But if you're at a point where you feel totally unfulfilled, you can't speak to your spouse because whatever you say, they have an issue with it. You're giving 100% all the time. You need to really find help. That is unsustainable.
Mm-hmm. So would it be fair to, let's say, sort of summarize that and say that in the ultimate ideal healthy marriage, each person's putting the spouse before themselves, but because they're both doing that, each of them is having their own identity and needs met. And so therefore, there's not really a contradiction between putting the other person before yourself and having your needs met, because you're both taking care of that for each other.
That's correct. But also at a certain point, it's to remember, do we have our needs? Just not always do we have the same needs, or not always are my needs more important than your needs. Mm-hmm. But as someone who puts away all their needs for their spouse, that's totally unhealthy. That can't.
Okay, so ultimately what it boils down to is let's say a healthy, well-adjusted awareness of the needs of both and being able to weigh them up and make, let's say, healthy decisions about when and where to prioritize which.
Right, and I would go a step further to have this conversation.
Right.
In a marriage, you need to have the conversation. And what I tell couples, at least the first year of marriage, meet once a week and talk about how it's going. What did you like this week? What would you like? What's on your wish list? And what else did you appreciate? Well, so the husband will say, dinner was always great, and I'm very happy about that. I would like if you can change this on the menu, or I would like if you don't mind picking up my the dry cleaners on a different day. And another compliment, the home is always so tidy, etc. Make sure to talk about the things, highlighting the good and making a wish list. And the same thing vice versa. It's so nice you come on time. I would appreciate, the wife would say, if you would respond to my WhatsApp a little bit earlier, etc., etc. So it's really talking about what's working. Because what usually happens in most relationships, people don't want to shake the boat or rock the boat. So what do? We keep it inside. We don't say. And the moment we say it, it comes out the wrong way. So it's not about the message. It's how the message is given. And if the message is given the wrong way, no one receives it the right way.
So, you've talked about how much work it takes to make things work out, etc., which, perhaps leads us into a conversation about when a marriage doesn't work out, right? So when it comes to divorce, there are cultures, perhaps Western culture to a degree, it's almost par for the course. People get married, they may or may not get divorced. There are some cultures where it's completely anathema and there isn't even such a thing as divorce, right? And the Jewish, let's say the Torah view on divorce is somewhere in between, right? It exists and it's there and should be pursued when necessary, but it is also very much a last resort. Do you have any insight, or can you share any insight maybe or clarification on what that position is, why it's such a last resort, why it's such a last resort? And is there anything maybe that can give us in terms of insight into the value and meaning of marriage?
So it's, in simple words, in many cultures, there's marriage is the front door and divorce is the back door. Right. For us, it's the emergency exit.
Like it.
And I once heard this great line. If divorce didn't exist, marriage would be a disaster. When you know that you're married and your spouse has no way out, you can become abusive. When you know that the emergency exit is there, the person says, I can't deal with it, you need to think much more and make sure you're doing a good enough job that this person doesn't opt out. So divorce is so important for marriage to work. At the same time, like we said, marriage is something that God wants for us to learn how to become better people. And why are you opting out? What's not working? So of course, there are red flags. There's very abusive stuff going on, and this needs to be evaluated with a therapist, with a rabbi. But the general concept is God wants us to work on it. No marriage can work if you don't put in effort. So if you're walking into marriage thinking, everything is beautiful. I saw my parents, they looked like they had a great marriage. You don't know what's going on, regardless, behind closed doors. But if that's your vision and you're not willing to put in effort, there's no way it's going to work.
Well, they may have had a great marriage, but the question is, how much work did they put in?
That's also true. That's also right. So you really need to put in effort. Judaism says when a person gets divorced, the altar in the temple cries. I once heard a question, why the altar? Because the altar represents the sacrifices. If you made some sacrifices, your marriage will work out. So for Judaism, marriage is very important. The unity of a man and a woman represents our relationship with God. You give it all you got. If it doesn't work, there's a way out. But that should not be, you shouldn't be walking into marriage thinking, okay, when can I get out?
You shouldn't be having your eye on the back door the whole time.
Exactly.
Emergency exit. Got it. So now, if we can wade into something that, I don't know, I'm going to maybe put you on the spot a little, but perhaps the foundational premise of the book, as in Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, is that there are these fundamental, stereotypical, perhaps biologically or genetically wired general differences between men and women. There's a very big movement in the broader culture today, in Western culture at least, that would push back against that very strongly. Do you have anything to say perhaps in addressing that as the foundation of this book and the message in the context of this, of Western culture's view towards it today?
So I would start with, obviously, Judaism doesn't follow Western culture. We have our own opinions. We follow the Torah, which is our Jewish guide. And it's very clear in biblical writings and Talmudic writings that we are different. Me and my wife are convinced that when we had our kids, we didn't tell our boys to play with guns or with balls and our girls to play with dolls, and it just happened naturally. So we're convinced it's biological. But regardless, if that's science or not, the reality is, in Jewish tradition, it's very clear in many places that there are differences. Today, even neurologists are seeing how women and men's brains work differently. But even let's put that on the side. The fact is today, whether it's nature or nurture, well, that's the big discussion, okay? The differences of men and women. As of now, there's still a lot of differences. So until that changes, the book is very helpful. So maybe one day science will be able to convince men and women to be the same, which I highly doubt, and I think would be a big mistake, because the uniqueness of marriage is the fact that we're different, okay? So having us the same and not having to work on the relationship, it's not going to fly. So the fact that we believe we're different, or whether, as I said, nurture, for sure, nurture is part of it, but we believe it's nature. The reality is, as of now, there are many differences, and therefore, if we understand the differences, we can make it work. If we try to say that differences don't exist, we're bound for a disaster.
And would you say that perhaps when there is a healthy mutual respect that sees the differences as not being more or less, but different and also equally of value, etc., that perhaps takes away some of the feeling that we need to compensate and eliminate those differences?
Great. It's not a competition. Exactly. When men and women became competition, that's when the problem started. We're not competing. We have different talents. Let's use it together. And that's really the success of a marriage.
Love it. Okay, now, final question. If you had to choose one single, either your favorite or what you think is the most important or impactful piece of advice about dating and or marriage, what would that number one piece of advice be?
I would go with this story, beautiful story. The Lubavitcher Rebbe once asked a girl who was a little older, he said, "Why didn't you get married yet?" And her response was, "I'm waiting for the perfect guy. I haven't met my Romeo." To which he responded, "You're reading too many novels. Marriage is not what it says in the novels. The novels, they portray marriage as this so romantic relationship. Love is when a couple, over many years, care for each other, they do the small things, and they weather the storms. After many years, they come to a point where they can't envision life one without the other. That's true love." And I think that's the most fascinating piece of advice I can take for myself and anyone else. The idea of love today is a mistake. Infatuation, we fell in love, that's not long-term. Working together on a relationship, going through the time, putting in the effort, until it comes to a point that you just really can't envision life without your spouse. That is a good marriage.
Wow, love it. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time, your input, etc. And Yeah, thank you again.
My pleasure, but I always have to end off with my final line. They say marriage is when man and woman decide to become one. The trouble begins when they're deciding which one.
Yes, like it. Love it. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.